Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. I'm recording this episode on the 15th of October at 3:30 p.m. I'm still in Belgium. And as of yet, the genocide in Gaza is still ongoing. If anything, it's accelerating, specifically in the north. The Israelis, while doing this, are also expanding their operations in southern Lebanon and just bombing kind of almost indiscriminately throughout the country. Yesterday there was an attack in the northern town of Ehdin in Genocidal, killing about, I think, 20 people. And if I'm not mistaken, most of them, if not all of them, were displaced people from the south. And there's no let up. There's no breaks. This is continuous, and it has been for over a year now. And all the while, there is this deafening silence from a very large majority of Europeans, of Americans, of essentially liberals. And so today I'm going to be talking about liberalism. I'm going to talk about its origins, but also what is it? Because it's definitely a term that's used incorrectly by self-described liberals, but also by people, I don't know, it's a fucked up term that honestly, growing up, there was this feeling that liberals were the good guys, and obviously not. And obviously not from Lebanon, from Palestine, from the global south, but also from a leftist perspective, from an awareness of the structures that are literally killing us and what alternatives exist. And so I'm going to talk about all that stuff in the context of genocide and in the context of an almost mass liberal acceptance, if not support, for genocide, specifically of Palestinians, and, continued aggression for anybody who's trying to do anything about it. And here I don't just mean armed groups in the region, but also activists and protesters and, anywhere across the world. So that's going to be the topic of this episode today. Before I get into any of that, I want to share a few sort of headlines. A couple of days ago, there's this picture that came out, this video of an Israeli firebomb attack of Al-Aqsa Martyr Hospital in Gaza that targeted tents just outside of the hospital, the entrance of the hospital. And the images are haunting. The images are, it's a Holocaust. I've no other word to describe it. This is mass slaughter of people by means of fire, by means of starvation. And in this image, there is a man who is on a hospital bed with an IV still attached to his arm. And he's on fire. And he's screaming out to the world. And he died. And his last moments were of displacement, of fear, of intense pain, and abandon. And his name was Sha'ban al-Dallu. He was 19 years old. And he died next to his mother, who was also killed and martyred in that attack. And just that image of his hand reaching out for anybody to save him amidst these flames, it's just fucking insanely, disgustingly, absurdly horrible. I don't know, there are no words. This is just yet another one of these images that's just burnt into my memory forever. And I don't know how anybody can see that and not connect it completely to Zionism, connect it completely to Netanyahu, to the state of Israel, to all the imperialist powers that are supporting it. And there's this juxtaposition that some people have made, especially like like Palestinian activists in Germany, wherein I think just the other day, the German foreign minister, part of the Green Party, which will segue well into the sort of discussion of liberals, defending Israel's attacks on hospitals, on medics, on schools, on mosques, on homes, on displaced tents, because, like the Israeli lie goes, they're used by Hamas. There is no proof of this. The complete opposite. The Israelis have destroyed hospitals, have destroyed so much of Gaza, and specifically in the hospitals have found nothing, even in their own investigations. And it doesn't even matter. That's actually even beside the point. They're just using their own logic to be like it's bullshit. But aside from that, there is absolutely no justification for completely destroying a hospital. And the fact that Germany is just all good with it is fucked. It's absolutely fucked. Another update is that the invasion of Lebanon by the Israelis is ongoing. And in the last few days, I think Hezbollah has managed to injure, from several attacks, up to, or I think at least 100 Israeli soldiers. And one incident of this is that they attacked a military training facility in the south of Haifa, and killing 4 and injuring about 70. And the way it's described is absolutely absurd by the BBC and by Sky News and by the Western press. They're given names, these soldiers, and they're called teenagers. And I still remember when CNN reported on the killing, the martyrdom of Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old. It described her as a young woman. And again, this is not new. The sort of, and this is a sort of white supremacist tradition wherein like black people in the US are kind of robbed of a childhood. They are like, young men from the age of 10. But so that attack happened, and yeah. And also a lot of the sort of invasion soldiers, whenever they try to go a bit further into territory, they're ambushed, they're attacked, and there have been quite a few successful attacks, repelling Israeli invaders. And yeah, I mean, so how has Israel responded? We have not seen yet the response for the attack on Haifa, but what have they been doing in the last few weeks? They've been attacking civilian targets. They've been committing massacres every single day. They've been attacking Beirut. They've been attacking the entire Be'a region. They have been replicating the evacuation orders that they... sorry, for those listening, I'm putting that in quotation marks. Of so many towns and villages throughout the south, even beyond the Litani River. Because again, all of their stuff is just complete bullshit. Any limits that they set for themselves when they talk about things, they have been, since the beginning, sort of manufacturing consent for the attacks on civilian infrastructure and homes by claiming that they're, micro weapons depots. And now they've been saying that Hezbollah have been using ambulances and other medical facilities for weapons and for transfers. Again, completely bullshit, but also just flying in the face of every single basic aspect of international law. And yeah, just giving themselves their excuse to attack hospitals, which they already are doing, and attacking medics, and attacking journalists, and attacking civilians. And it's just absolutely fucked. But you can see for sure that the sort of like false dichotomy, wherein in this instance Hezbollah is, I mean, throughout the last year have been mostly focusing on military infrastructure, military targets, on soldiers. And honestly, I think Western media, by their conflation or by their like focus and selective sympathy for Israeli soldiers and lack thereof for Arab, as in Palestinian and Lebanese and Syrian civilians, they are doing the job of like obfuscating or blurring the lines between civilian and military targets. They are essentially, through their discourse, justifying the attacks on civilians and doing that kind of human shield rhetoric, that basically every Israeli soldier is a human and every Arab civilian is not. And yeah. Also, still bullshit with UNIFIL. The Israelis actually attacked a UNIFIL compound. They burst in with their tanks. And this is the UN. The Israelis also made Guterres, whatever, the Secretary General of the UN, he's persona non grata in the state of Israel. Like, I don't know what else they need to fucking do to be isolated, to be unseated. They have nothing but contempt for the UN. Anyway, so those are some updates from the last few days. Now, on to the main topic, which is liberalism, liberals, and genocide. So I'm definitely not a historian, and so I'm not going to be able to give that like thorough description of how it formed and who are the main thinkers. But I think suffice for this analysis, it's enough to say that liberalism as a political and economic idea forms in Europe during the Enlightenment and is set against like monarchies and autocratic rule and feudalism, which are all bad systems. There's something interesting when like reading Marx, wherein, even for Marx, like capitalism, as bad as it is, it's better than feudalism. But regardless, it's sort of, there are certain ideals, but it's connected with certain economic policies, and with the development of a new capitalist mercantile class, and specifically with industrialization, that you begin to have these thinkers and ideas of liberty. And again, I think something I want to say again that I said at the beginning is that liberty is good. That there are certain liberal ideals which are just good. I believe in them. I think it's very hard to be an empathetic, progressive person. I mean, there's many ideas under socialism that's still liberal, but it's not liberalism. And I say this very importantly because growing up, and like a lot of people within the periphery of the American empire, I followed American politics. I understood the American discourse and terminologies much more so than our own. And so yeah, to me, growing up, the liberals were the good guys and the conservatives were the bad guys. And it only took till I got a bit older and started understanding socialism and leftism that I started noticing the similarities between the liberal camp and the conservative camp, and specifically in the United States and the UK, wherein they're basically subservient, or they serve the business class, the bourgeoisie. They are two faces of the bourgeois class. And neither of them are an actual working class movement. None of those ideals actually... I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'll slow down. So liberalism really takes shape in like the 17th, 18th century in Europe. And there's a really important document like that sort of sums up not just what liberalism is, its potentials, its like actually good nature or whatever, but also its limitations, like I'll be discussing mostly today. And that is the American Constitution. For the time, it's a radical document. And even reading it now as a kind of manifesto, it just reads very, like every citizen, every person. And it's also, it doesn't demand anything of people. What it says is that the government is not allowed to interfere in people's lives. The government is not allowed to stop you from saying, freedom of expression, freedom of whatever. And I believe in freedom of speech. Obviously, I believe in freedom of expression. There's one thing within liberalism that is lesser discussed, and I think it is the main thing that sets it apart from leftism, which is its relation to capitalism, which is its relation to private property. Because this is a very important thing. The government, the state, cannot tell you you cannot say this. They can also not tell you where to put your money and what to do with your money and what to do with your property. And this allows, part of it, who's the government to say what I should do, what I'm allowed to do with my factory, what I'm allowed to do with my employees? And obviously that favors the moneyed class. And again, within the Constitution, it specifies property. I don't know the exact wording of the Constitution, but this is de facto true, that it prioritizes and only really identifies property owning men. And so, yeah, obviously this whole idea favors those that already have property. And who is able to have property but white men, and specifically white men of at least the petit bourgeois, the lower bourgeois, up to the high bourgeois and the aristocracy. And this is the main difference in terms of its relation to capitalism and property specifically, wherein for liberals there is this common sense idea that, well, it's yours. You should be able to do what you want with it. And here I'm not talking about your phone or your toothbrush or anything. I'm talking about, when I talk about private property, Marxists make this difference between private property and personal property. Private property is stuff that you can make money with, that you can use to create more, income, goods, profit, essentially. And so here we're talking about things like machines, things like factories, like production, This is what's referred to as means of production. And so, most wealth is inherited anyway. Okay, I know this is going to be a bit messy because I'm not really a historian, like I said. But yeah, I think that is one of the biggest things. Because, actually, this is a super interesting fact that I discovered, and I think sums up a lot of this. I discovered that the United States Supreme Court decision, known as Citizens United, which essentially allowed for unlimited donations to campaigns, as in, again, the government cannot tell you or set limits on how much you can donate to a specific candidate, which obviously creates, honestly, the world's most corrupt democratic system. That passed, and that was defended and approved by the Supreme Court under the First Amendment of the Constitution. That kind of broke my brain when I first discovered it, because I did not understand how that makes any sense. The First Amendment allows for freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And so I was reading it, And how they're arguing it is essentially, if I want to advocate for a candidate running for president, and I want to advocate X amount, the government cannot tell me, no, that's too much. X plus 10, X plus 20, I want to give 10 speeches, 1,000 speeches, I want to talk to 1,000,000 people. I am free to talk and express my approval or endorsement of this candidate as much as I please, and the government is not allowed to, by the First Amendment, tell me not to. Now, what's the difference between giving a speech and giving money for someone else to give a speech? What's the difference between me saying, I endorse this candidate, and me endorsing this candidate with my money? This is the actual logic of it. If the connection of like donations with endorsement, and so if that's the connection they made, which is the connection they made, then the government cannot limit the amount that I want to support a certain candidate by the amount of money that I give them. That's insane. That is literally the recipe for a completely corrupt oligarchical system, which is what we have in the United States. Again, the United States is not a democracy, it is an oligarchy. It is a plutocracy. This is not me. This is like, I think Stanford, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I used to be obsessed with this study where they sort of mapped out policy demands and like, you know, based on income and what the top 1% income bracket want and what the lower 70% want. And they showed that the lower 70% never get what they want, and the top 10% always get what they want. And these are the structures that manifest this reality. And that is acceptable within liberalism. That is liberalism. Liberalism has no antagonism with capitalism. The only thing they ever talk about is a kind of regulation. But even that, as we see, regulation is still like in conflict with the sort of liberal economic ideas, which is oftentimes described as neoliberalism, of like removing any state, whatever. I don't want to get into neoliberalism. That starts to get a lot more complicated, even though it's not that different. It's not actually new and it's not actually liberal, because it still involves a lot of state investment into local production and manufacturing. Anyway, another massive reason why liberalism is fucked up, or rather, I should finish that last point. Liberalism has no antagonism to capitalism, whereas something like socialism or all the leftist traditions do, because they clearly see in advocating for the rights and the sort of liberty and dignity of all people that the existence of private property, as in one person or a group of people is allowed to control a factory, control the means of production, is, no matter what, that relationship is always going to be asymmetrical, and there's always going to be a dependence from the working class of the bourgeoisie. And that leads to monopolies, that leads to exploitation. And so in this sort of pursuit of a revolutionary change for the benefit of the general population, there is this constant advocacy from the left of either like nationalizing private property or abolishing private property. No one gets to own anything. Rather, the factories should be owned by the people who work in the factory. The market should be owned. The farm should be run and owned, and decisions should be made by the people who run it. Because, yeah, again, I'm not going to go through the whole, actually, what is leftism, because that would require so much more. But just to say, there is not that much space between liberal and conservative. From a class perspective, it's very little. From a colonial perspective, there's very little space between them. And yeah, and so there's this interesting thing where it feels like they're, left and right, liberal and conservative. But actually, I mean, it's much more like liberal and conservative are both, center right, further right. I mean, the Republican Party in the United States is absolutely fucked. I'm not at all saying that they're the same party, but mostly what they disagree on are more cultural things, or to what extent should we let the market, run a fucking muck. But these both exist kind of center to the right of the center. And then there's this huge tradition and history of leftism that stretches from like anarcho-communism to like state socialism. And those are actually differences. Anyway, another massive, massive difference between liberalism and what is described loosely as the left is, I mean, this is fundamental. Who is considered human? And here we get into issues of colonialism, of slavery, of genocide. Because again, in the American Constitution, it is only land-owning men. And who gets to own land? White men. And how many people at the time of the writing of this document in the United States of America were slaves? Were men and women and children stolen, taken from the African continent and brought to the Americas and forced and bought and literally traded as commodities. And not only is this like acceptable within this liberal framework, it is baked in. All the founders, all the piece of shit white men who wrote this document were slave owners. And slavery, or rather the transatlantic slave trade, was a form of genocide, because not only the innumerable people who were killed on the way while there, but also the complete detachment from their culture, the complete destruction of their cultures, of their languages, of their traditions. It's honestly, there's a lot to read about this. I will not be able to do this topic justice here. But it is enough to say that genocide is, again, like permissible within liberalism, because all these liberal ideals that we see coming out of the Enlightenment, that is like cemented within the Constitution, negates and ignores and erases all non-white men. Again, at the time, women could not vote. Women were property. Marriage was an institution of property. And so liberalism is not only potentially and, manifestly a genocidal ideology, a capitalist ideology. It is also imperialist. It is also patriarchal. And so it doesn't have to necessarily, again, some of the ideals. I'm not one to say that the entire framework of human rights is fucked, or freedom of expression, because I don't advocate for autocracy or monarchy or anything, or fascism. But like what we're seeing today with so many liberal leaders and so much of the liberal world who talk about, again, the most basic right is the right to life. And that is denied to basically the rest of the world. Another really important example of this whole contradiction is the Haitian Revolution, which was inspired by the French Revolution. They're described as the Black Jacobins, and they picked up the mantle of fraternité, liberty, fraternity, whatever, égalité. And they saw themselves like, oh yeah, those ideas are great. And this is again what I'm saying when I say that, like, I don't reject the ideas. I reject how the ideas are manifest, but also some of the contradictions within the ideas, because I think a really important thing to point out is, under liberalism, there's this idea of freedom of expression and freedom of whatever, but you're not actually free in the workplace. There is no democracy in the workplace. You have to listen to your boss, the boss has to listen to his boss, the boss has to listen to his boss, and then even up to the CEO has to listen to the shareholders. It is strictly hierarchical. It functions like an autocratic society, and there's no actual liberalism within the company, within the corporation. And so that's a massive contradiction that is sort of like resolved with the seizing of the means of production and the sort of like operation of these things by the workers themselves. Anyway, so the Haitian Revolution is still something that I think haunts the West, essentially, because here are a bunch of black men in Haiti, uh, you know, like literally men who are brought as slaves and working in plantations in Haiti for decades, for almost like 2 centuries. And I need to read the Black Jacobins actually, because I'm sure there is a lot more to this. Again, I feel really bad bringing up these topics and not being able to do it full justice. But again, it's important to note that the Haitian Revolution was crushed by the French, by Napoleon. That the French Revolution, which inspired the Haitian Revolution, then sent in its army, crushed it, because what's important is its liberty for us, subjugation for you. That it is all these ideals for us humans, and it is domination and exploitation for you subhumans, for you non-humans. And again, this is so like connected with how there's this selective empathy and sympathy with the state of Israel, with literally with the soldiers who are committing genocide, than there are with actual babies, with children, with the entire communities that are so uprooted and massacred in Palestine and now in Lebanon. That there is more identification with them, not out of some ideal, not out of some whatever, but because they are human, because they are seen as human, and we are not. And this is a core facet of white supremacy that is still found within liberalism. And honestly, that's sort of where fascism is bred. It's described that fascism is capitalism in crisis, or is a response to a capitalist crisis. And we can certainly see that. Because what happens is the sphere of who is considered to be human gets smaller and smaller. And that small group starts to become more quote unquote defensive. And it's no coincidence that the state of Israel talks about defense, that the state of Germany, in defending Israel, talks about defense, that every colonial regime talks about defense, that even the Nazi party talked about defense, defending the white race. The myth of white genocide still exists, and it's this idea that we need to protect ourselves. And once that idea gets smaller and smaller of who we are, then that system becomes more and more violent, because they feel more isolated, even though it's a self-isolation. And so I think there's something so important to highlight here, that liberals are not the good guys. I mean, I've known this for a very long time, but I feel like it's become a bit of a meme these days to talk shit about liberals. And I mean, it's true. Go shit on your local liberal. I don't care. It's just I want to provide some sort of overview of why we shit on liberals and why liberalism is an incomplete ideology. It is an ideology that is a bit too comfortable with white supremacy, with capitalism, certainly with patriarchy, and as we've seen, manifest in the most horrendous ways with imperialism. And I don't know, I think that's something that I know liberals don't really listen to this channel and they don't like listening to these critiques. And the title I'm going to be picking is not very inviting of liberals. But yeah, I don't know. I think all this needs to be said. Liberalism is something that was a very necessary thing. I mean, to Marx, there's sort of these ideas. I'm not that into Marx, but I'm finding myself reading a lot of like Lebanese Marxists. And so having to understand Marx a little bit. And so I find myself then saying words like contradiction and, scientific examination of history. But that liberalism, comes out of a certain time and certain ideals. Oh, there's a really interesting book. The second last book of David Graeber before he passed away, The Dawn of Everything. And there's a very interesting sort of analysis there that a lot of these Enlightenment ideals actually are like co-optations of like white European observations of indigenous American communities. Because I think they say that one of the first essays written about inequality, not by Rousseau, but by some Enlightenment thinker, there's sort of this, who the fuck's talking about inequality? Where does that come from? And there is a sort of timeline, but also, I don't know, sorry, I shouldn't bring up stuff that I don't know enough about to talk about, but it's definitely an interesting book, and I was reading it up until October 7, and since then I haven't been able to pick it up because shit got really fucked. Anyway, I think that's it. I'm sure I missed a lot, but yeah, I think this is enough for an episode just sort of loosely talking about why I can't stand liberals, why liberals don't actually know what they're talking about, and why it needs to be contested and opposed. And we need to take more seriously ideas of socialism, ideas of anarchism and leftism that are real, that are rooted in a humanism that understand everybody as human and not just certain convenient groups of people, but also one that actually seeks for liberation, one that seeks for emancipation, that is not just a management of the current system, but an overthrow of the system, and a rebalancing of things. And again, with climate crisis, with the realities of nuclear war, with this sort of normalization of genocide and genocidal violence are necessary. And so my next video essay, I am actually going to be talking a lot about this because, as I said in the last episode, where are the Arabs? A lot of Arabs are very much so buying into liberal bullshit. Anyway, or like expecting international law. God. Okay. I think that's it. I'm sort of repeating myself at this point, so I'll wrap it up here. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, you can support this work in a number of ways. You can become a member of our Patreon, which not only helps support this podcast, but it helps several others, including the Fire These Times. And you get exclusive content like my sub-series, Keep This Between Us. Or you can sort of give a one-time donation in the tip jar below. Or just tell your friends or family, and obviously leave a rating wherever you're listening to it, or thumbs up if you're listening to this on YouTube. Anyway, I hope you're all doing all right, and I'll see you all next time. See you.